This is the Etiology podcast. I am your host, Alka Kubaku, licensed social worker and psychotherapist. In this podcast, we explore divisive issues around food, health, and body image with the goal of mending relationships within the eating disorder recovery professional community and creating a space where a multiplicity of perspectives can coexist harmoniously. This podcast is uncensored and encompasses the political and ideological spectrum. If you believe something you hear is harmful or misinformed, please be respectful to the speaker, and also feel free to reach out about recording another episode on the same topic from your vantage point. My hope is that if, as professionals, we can hold each other's stories with respect and compassion, we'll be better able to do so for our clients. When I studied psychology, I learned about psychoanalysis, the id, the ego, the superego, the mind depicted as an iceberg with the subconscious submerged beneath the surface. We covered psychosexual development and the Oedipus complex. Some of it seemed relevant. Some of it seemed overly speculative. Mostly, though, it was presented as part of the history of psychotherapy, a relic of the past that had been absorbed into mainstream thought and then largely replaced by more targeted, manualized treatments. And then I met Denise, who is now my supervisor, during a job interview. Denise made the bold claim that if Freud had lived another 200 years, he would have discovered everything we now know about psychotherapy. Her office had an entire shelf filled with volumes of Freud's work, and she had studied psychoanalysis intensively, part of which included undergoing her own psychoanalysis. Denise shared books and articles where I could read about contemporary psychoanalysis, and I began to see how it overlaps with the somatic embodied approaches I am most drawn to. In this episode, Denise shares how and why she was drawn to psychoanalysis. We talk about the role of the unconscious, symptom management versus root causes, the somatic experience, the therapeutic relationship, and whether or not, as psychoanalysis is often accused to be, the therapist is actually a blank slate. We touch on the setting where the patient lies on the couch and spills out the contents of their own mind, and discuss psychosexual development, the Oedipus complex, and erotic transference. This episode isn't specifically about eating disorders, but more broadly, psychoanalysis, just to note. Denise is a psychotherapist, practice owner, and certified psychoanalyst. She specializes in working with adults and adolescents dealing with depression, stress and anxiety, bipolar disorder, ADHD, PTSD, relationship concerns, and attachment issues. She also offers couples counseling, family therapy, and parenting support. Denise earned her Master's of Social Work from Loyola University and a graduate certificate in adult psychoanalysis from the Wisconsin Psychoanalytic Institute, where she now teaches. She also supervises psychology graduate students at Northwestern University, where she earned her bachelor's degree in engineering. Hi, Denise. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, Elka. Thanks for having me.
So I'll just specify that this episode is not specifically about eating disorders. We'll talk about psychoanalysis more broadly. And so you own a group practice. You're a therapist. You're my supervisor. You teach at Northwestern. Can you tell me or tell our listeners a little bit about what you do as a therapist, as a therapist and teacher as it relates to psychoanalysis?
Okay, that's a broad question, but I guess I would frame it as the way I look at the world is very psychoanalytic. I mean, psychoanalysis is a therapeutic approach that delves into the unconscious, and seeks to understand like how your early experiences shape what happens to you now and what you do now. As a treatment, it's based on the theory that our present is shaped by our past, right? So we look at that and try and make connections between what happened to you in the past and it maybe in your childhood and how that is manifesting now. Carl Jung has a great quote that I love, that he says that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And I like that.
That's really interesting and feels very true. So when you say psychoanalysis, what you mean is looking at the way that past has or influences present?
Yeah. I mean, it's based on the theories by Freud and a lot of other people, Kohut, Jung, all these theoretical frameworks basically have the same foundation, which talks about making the unconscious conscious.
Yeah. When you talk about making the unconscious conscious, what I hear is a little bit different than sometimes the way that past influencing present can translate, where I'll see people who are very much like, something is going wrong now. There must be something in the past leading to it that feels like very much an intellectual process.
Mhm.
Can you tell me about how what you do is different from that?
Yeah, I don't feel like it's an intellectual process at all. It's very much based in felt experience. What's happening now and the pain you're in now, understanding that, and then where that started. When else did you feel that pain? Where do you think that pain comes from? Looking at early childhood experience or family of origin relationships, and the places you were injured. It's a very emotional process. So I don't feel like it's a intellectual exercise at all.
Yeah. But when you talk about going into the felt experience, that feels a little bit closer. And we've talked about this a little bit in supervision before, but that feels a little closer to embodied approaches that are coming back in now.
Yeah. I mean, I really think all the approaches now that they all have different names, right? And they all use different buzzwords, but they're all basically psychoanalytic approaches. They're all aiming to do the same thing in my mind, which is to understand where our pain comes from and help treat that so that we don't have and manifest that pain in the present.
Yeah. And when you say understand, we're not talking about an intellectual understanding, but
It's
an
it's a deep
emotional.
knowing. It's a deep
Hmm.
knowing and a deep understanding and um felt experience of why we do what we do.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about what that process looks like when you're using psychoanalysis to connect to the unconscious
I
in that
think
deep knowing?
yeah, I think what I encourage my patients to do the most is to think out loud. You know, basically the way to get at the unconscious in a psychoanalytic framework is to have people free associate as much as they can and follow their trains of thought. Like, so we were just talking about, your mother, and you went directly to this thing you saw in the news about, being locked up. Why do you think that came up when we thought about your mother together? Like, what following trains of thought and trying to understand why we associate one thing with something else. And that leads to an emotional experience of, oh, wow, I hadn't thought about it that way, or I hadn't, felt that feeling in a long time. Or I didn't even recognize that this news story made me think about my mother, right? That's sort of, they say when you can really free associate, you're done with treatment because it's so hard to do. Getting people to talk out loud or think out loud and talk in an uncensored way is very difficult because we censor ourselves all the time based on what we think the other person wants to hear, based on what we want to reveal or don't want to reveal, based on our defenses that are purely unconscious, and we don't even recognize that we're censoring our thoughts.
So when you're teaching somebody to free associate, essentially you're teaching them, can you allow whatever's running through your mind to be here and to enter this space?
Yes, that's exactly right. That's how you would put it. Absolutely. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
Allow all thoughts and all feelings to be in the room.
Mhm. Yeah. You've talked before a little bit about, I think the one of the images that comes to mind when people hear psychoanalysis is that like the client or patient laying on the couch, which I know that even the words patient and client, there's what to talk about there. I feel like that's one of the but so you have
I don't
uh
always have people lie on the couch. Like if I'm doing a real analysis where the person's coming, 4 and 5 times a week and they use the couch, that's extremely rare. Um,
mhm.
I think the reason for the couch makes sense though, because if you think about it, when you're looking at someone, you are unconsciously adapting to what you see all the time. Every second, you're basing it on their facial expression, the way they say something, if they sit back in their chair or forward in their chair, you are always adjusting to the other person. And the thing the couch or what the couch tries to eradicate is that the visual noise, right? That gets in our way.
Yeah. Yeah, that was interesting to me when you had told me that because I had done a brain spotting training a little while back, which is a derivative of EMDR. And essentially, you have the person look at a particular whatever gaze spot that's supposed to be connected to activation. Anyway, when I've done it with patients or clients, whatever preferred term, what I've the feedback I've gotten from people often was exactly what you're describing, that just having my eyes somewhere else away from you allowed me to process more deeply.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
for some people, maybe it is that particular spot. I don't know, but just that being able to think freely and bring it into the room.
absolutely. And not be conscious all the time of what you're doing with your face. Are you making that expression out loud? Are you saying something with your face you didn't intend to say? So
Yeah, this is like sort of unrelated, but I had a video client yesterday, and for some reason the emoji setting was turned on, and they were doing some like self-nurturing thing and like holding their hands like this, and like a stream of hearts came trickling out
that's
of
so intrusive and hilarious on one level, but I hate
yeah,
emoji things that respond to what people are saying. I hate that.
yeah. It was very
But that's
funny, and
yeah.
yeah. What role, if any, does when you talk about the subconscious, the way that that's often talked about in more contemporary somatic type therapies is emotions as or experiences as they live in the body. I'm curious to what extent, if at all, the body plays a role or is incorporated into
Oh,
psychoanalysis.
I think the body plays a huge role. And I think that I can't cite chapter and verse where Freud talked about it, but he does. The body is, your memories are stored in your body. So even things your mind can't remember, your body remembers. So if you think about treating trauma of any kind, you have to incorporate bodily sensations and where what you're talking about is felt in the body, because your body remembers so much more than your mind does.
Hmm. So, from a psychoanalytic framework, you'd also do that, getting in touch with sensation. Where does this live in your body? What's that like?
Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely.
very interesting.
I probably use a little bit different language for it. I probably do it a little differently than you do it, but it's the same
Hmm.
thing.
Yeah. Can you talk me through a little bit of what that might look like in the session?
If somebody's having a deep feeling or expressing something intellectually that seems like it would be linked to a deep feeling, I often ask them, where do they feel it in their body? Do they feel tense anywhere? Does their stomach feel like butterflies or upset, or does something hurt in their body right now? Like, I will often ask those questions to see if there's more of a link there that they can attach to, and that it has a bodily sensation that they haven't been aware of in the past. I mean, I've
Yeah.
treated people who have talked about being numb from the jaw down, like they have so cut off their body sensations because of trauma, that doing that kind of work is super important and also very difficult sometimes.
That's pretty wild.
It is to have it be so extreme or the trauma be so great that they literally cut themselves off at the neck and won't attach to anything below.
Yeah. So you're guiding them to come back to their bodies and to
Yes.
notice what's there.
Yeah, to just be able to feel again.
Yeah. Another question, and something that I think is often misunderstood about psychoanalysis, that I think I sort of had this impression before meeting you, was that the like sort of therapist as blank slate. And I've actually had I had someone I had interviewed with a while ago who told me that their office was previously owned by a psychoanalyst, and they had found crossword puzzles like by their chair that the psychoanalyst had been reading while which is obviously a misuse.
That's
I've heard from
horrifying.
someone else who said their analyst fell asleep on them. Um
That's actually horrifying.
yeah.
No, I don't believe in a blank screen. I don't, and Freud didn't believe in a blank screen. So I mean, it's crazy that that's where people think that comes from. He was anything but a blank screen. He had two dogs in his office. If you've ever seen his office, it very much resembles who he was as a person. There's statues and books and rugs. And I mean, there is no such thing as a blank screen. There are two people's unconscious in that room, and you have to deal with both of them.
Yeah. And like you're definitely not a blank screen.
No.
You're you're the opposite of blank screen. Like you're
I'm not
um
sure if that's good or bad, Elka.
it's good. Like I feel like you're very emotionally present. And I mean, as my supervisor, I feel like And I know like supervisor, supervisee is different than
It is,
patient
but not
therapist,
much.
but
It is in
yeah,
some ways, but not much. I mean, I'm teaching both of you, right? Like
right.
patient and clinician how to be in the room with people and how to understand what they're hearing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel that you're pretty willing to share your own experience, which I appreciate a lot. Um, yeah, I'm wondering like where that notion,
Started the blank screen.
yeah.
Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's talked about a little bit in one of Freud's papers, but he never intended for people to be a blank screen.
Hmm. Yeah. The other notion that I hear often is when we talk about interpretation, and I think this also goes back to the misunderstanding it as an intellectual exercise, but sort of like the therapist or psychoanalyst is offering their own interpretations, which and presenting them with an aura of truth or reality. Um, when in actuality, if you're interpreting something, you're also pulling from your own
Exactly. Your own unconscious.
story.
That's right. In your own story. Yeah, I wouldn't say I would say it's extremely rare that I offer an interpretation as a fact. I almost always offer an interpretation as I wonder if this, or I find myself wondering this, and see if the patient can attach to anything in that or weigh in on that or say yes or no. Yes, that's exactly it. Or no, that doesn't resonate.
Yeah. So you're noticing patterns, identifying them out loud, and checking with the patient. Does this match your experience?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's go into your story a little bit and how you got here. You were an engineer before.
Yeah, I graduated from Northwestern with an engineering degree, and I worked as an engineer for about 6 years for IBM,
Hmm.
a systems engineer, and it was a very different. It's a very different way of thinking, a very different kind of work, but it's still problem solving, right? So there's a piece of me that's the same. I think what's different to me about what I do now is that there's not a right answer. I kind of miss when I was an engineer, there was always one right answer.
Totally.
And now everything depends. There is no one right answer. Sometimes I miss that. Sometimes I don't. But anyway, I worked as an engineer for 6 years and then I decided to go back to grad school because I really felt like I wanted to be helping people and not just making money and not help people with, learn how to plug in their computer. That, you know, didn't didn't make my day.
Yeah. When I was in grad school, I had taken an elective on quantitative research methods, and I had a little bit of that sentiment that you're describing here. It was like there was a kind of comfort in it, like that this is just so clear, it's logical, it makes sense. And whereas like in our field,
There's none of that.
there's none of that. There's none of
Very
that
rarely is
clarity.
it logical or makes logical sense.
Yeah. When were you in your personal or professional life first exposed to psychoanalysis?
Oh, honestly, I probably had been in therapy for, gosh, a long time before I was exposed to psychoanalysis. I was in therapy with an analyst, um, who was amazing. And I read this book. She suggested I read this book by Peter Gay called "A Freud, a Man for All Time" or for his time. I read that. I devoured that book. It took me months to go through it because every time there was a citation, I would go read the original transcript of something else. Like it was so fascinating to me and so interesting. And the day I finished that book, I applied to psychoanalytic training. But that
Wow.
wasn't until I'd been working as a professional for a very long time and also in therapy for a very long time.
You were already a therapist at that
I was
point.
already a therapist. I already had my own practice, not as big a practice as I run now, just a solo practice. And yeah, and I'd been in therapy for, gosh, I don't even want to say how long, a long time.
You were in therapy with a psychoanalyst.
Yes.
Doing your own, like, were you in your
My
own
own.
psychoanalysis at that time, or was it
No, but I
just,
started when you apply to analytic training, you have to start your own personal analysis. So I switched from just being a psychoanalytic psychotherapy patient to being an analytic patient with my same analyst, and
Mhm.
started my analysis when I applied. So
Yeah. You had been in therapy for a long time before
yeah,
psychoanalysis.
yes.
Can you describe a little bit of what that therapy was like and what gap it left behind that psychoanalysis build?
Um, I think I started in therapy due to my own pain level, having had a tumultuous childhood. I call myself a feral child. I didn't have a lot of parenting and I had a lot of trauma. So I started therapy mostly to deal with that, the aftermath of trauma. And I think, and I spent, I don't know, I want to say about 10 years in therapy with maybe two or three different therapists. And it's not that I didn't get anything from that. I did. I think I learned about myself and I grew, but I didn't ever really understand the roots of why I had so much pain. I don't think I think it was much more focused on um the here and now and what was causing me pain in the current moment as opposed to any kind of look back to what had started the pain, right? Or what could be back there that started this process. So I think that was left missing for me.
So, was it like you started to feel like you had some way of coping with the pain, but the pain was still there in its full intensity with no real
Yeah.
insight into where it was coming from or what it even was?
Yeah, I had more skills to deal with it. I don't think I acted it out as much. I don't think I think I could handle it in the moment. But I didn't ever feel like I really understood it.
Mhm.
And so it never went away, I guess is my point.
Yeah. It feels, I sometimes think of those childhood things or almost as the reservoirs that feed into, like in cognitive behavior therapy, you have the cognitive triangle, like thoughts, emotions, behaviors. And it feels like some of those childhood experiences are almost like a reservoir that's continually fueling that cycle. So you
Abs-
start to shift the cycle, but there's something constantly feeding into it.
Absolutely. I mean, my issue with things like CBT, DBT are not that they're not useful. I think they can be extremely useful for symptom relief if someone is in a lot of pain, but I don't think they look at the root of the pain itself, and so it just shifts to another place. Like it's like matter in science. It never disappears, it just changes form. And I think our pain is very much like that.
Yeah. What started to happen to it for you once you entered psychoanalysis?
Um I would say my analyst at that time was extremely talented. And I had already done a lot of work even before I started my personal analysis, just because of the way she worked. Psychoanalytic psychotherapy is similar to analysis in a lot of ways. It's just not quite as intense. I think the starting my own analysis, the intensity of going to therapy like 4 times a week is a little overwhelming, but it also is the fastest way to get at those underlying roots because you're always in it. It feels like you're always immersed in it. Now that's some people's version of hell for a while, and and it was sort of Dante's, 14th circle for a while, but it it also allowed me to really deeply understand what this pain was that I had all the time, that I was trying to get rid of all the time, right? It allowed me to really immerse myself in it and look at it and think, why do I have this and where does it come from? Did that answer your question? I
Yeah.
don't even remember the question anymore, Elka.
I don't either. Um, I let you face the pain completely.
Yeah.
That sounds brutal.
It was, I will not lie, it was pretty brutal the first year and a half. It was pretty brutal. Um, but it was also a relief in a way. I'd been fighting this pain off for, so many years, my whole life, that as brutal as it was also sort of like, well, okay, here it is. If I can survive this, I can get better, right?
Yeah, you stopped fighting it and let yourself just get
Yeah.
swallowed up in it for a time.
Little bit swallowed up in it for a time. And I don't recommend analysis for everybody. I really don't. You have to have a certain set of skills to even deal with kind of the brutality of that first year, And it wasn't all like that. It just had more moments of that. It was a deeper kind of therapy than I'd ever done.
Yeah. What got you through? How long was that period of this? So you said 4 days,
4 days a week,
4 days a week, you're spending an hour
an
at a
hour,
time,
yeah, or 45 minutes.
45 minutes to an hour,
Yeah.
just like sinking into your
Yeah,
pain.
trying to look at my associations and look at my mind and really understand why I think the way I do and why I do the things I do based on thinking the way I do, that kind of stuff. And there's always the look back, right? Like if you find yourself feeling this way in the present, where did that start? What started that process? And that's the part that was brutal. Looking back was a little brutal, but it was healing in so many ways. I mean, I can't state enough how psychoanalysis saved my life. It was amazing. It was an amazing transformation, it felt like.
As you're, let me actually walk through this one step at a time. So as you're like getting really sucked into your pain, and it sounds like it took some time till you started to experience relief. But what carried you through that time? What let you know, like, I can handle this, I'll get through this, and it will be helpful?
I think I really believed in the process. I think you have to at base trust the process and believe that the process is going somewhere. If you don't, it's really hard to get through the times that are brutal. But if you trust the process and believe in the process and know that there's an outcome that's going to be positive, it's much easier to get through kind of that time that feels so rough.
What gave you that belief?
Really my studying of Freud and the process, and I started reading everything I could find on analysis and I was already doing the work. I was already working as a therapist, and so I could see people get better. And now I felt like I was understanding why they were getting better in a much different and deeper way. So I trusted the process already because I was part of it for other people.
You were facilitating it with other people, and you also had a conceptual framework that made sense and positioned what you were experiencing as one stage in a larger process.
Yeah.
I'm sure this varies by person, but how long would you say it takes, or let's just say it took for you or for some of the people you work with to start to experience some of the positives?
In some ways it's hard looking back at it, right? Because our view changes. Just looking back at it changes what it was. I don't know if I would have had the same answers in the middle of it as I have now. So that's sort of what it is. But I think that even early on in the process, I felt seen in a different way. I felt heard in a different way. And so even if what was going on inside me was hard and difficult and kind of brutal, the actual holding of the analytic space was really healing for me. And very quickly, I felt that. I didn't always feel great when I wasn't in that space. But when I was in that space, feeling seen and heard and believed and listened to was very healing and very positive. And you have that kind of every day during the week for a while. That alone is very healing. You have someone every day committed that hour to you and to listen to you and to understand you and to hear you and to see you. And I don't think I've ever been seen in that way before. So that to me, that was the biggest positive right off the bat.
Yeah. Right off the bat, you felt like this was a space that could hold my pain in a way that other therapies didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I could really just be and say whatever I wanted and speak back of my thought process or what I was expressing. It was all curiosity. It was all just a space of curiosity. Why do I think that way? Why do I feel that? What's that about? And judgment free.
Mm. Yeah. And in that way, it differs from skills-based therapies that can have an element of like, let me fix you,
Yes.
if you're
Let me
having this
take
level
away
of anger, like how can we bring it down to here?
right. Let me take away that pain. Let me fix you or give you
Mhm.
skills so you don't feel that way anymore. Instead of why do I feel that way? What is that telling me?
Yeah. The rhetoric feels so similar to third wave therapies and somatic. And I know I say this a lot, but that rhetoric of like the pain is there, we don't need to get rid of it. It's interesting also because oftentimes psychoanalysis, I've seen it positioned as the opposing force, as like the doctor as expert kind of. Whereas like new therapies are like the client is expert. And what you're describing is the epitome of patient as expert on their own story.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, the third wave kinds of theories all started with psychodynamics. I mean, they're all very psychodynamic if you look at the roots of them and what they really believe. They aren't that different. They're just kind of expanded, you know, and they're talked about in a different way. Like I said, they have different lingo and different phrases and different way of speaking, but it's basically the same stuff. I mean, I do believe that the therapist is sort of the expert in the room, but only not the expert on the person. The person is the expert on themselves. You're the expert in like how to help them learn from that, right? You're the expert in the technique and the theory and the things that might be helpful to them, but the patient is the expert in the patient.
Yeah. You're the expert on creating the frame or that space that you said was so healing for you.
Right.
And they're the one who then fills that space.
Right. Right. And going back to like the blank screen stuff, I think it started with people trying to understand what transference and countertransference is. And this misunderstanding, this fundamental misunderstanding that everything is a projection, right? That the patient just projects all of their stuff onto you. You can help them figure it out. I don't think that does happen, but that's not the core of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. That brings me to something interesting that I learned from you a little bit. And you had given me something to read a while back talking about countertransference. It does, and this is where it feels like psychoanalysis differs a little bit from what I'm used to seeing in third wave therapies and embodied approaches. So what I'm used to seeing in terms of the therapist-client relationship is sort of like the therapist is in the role of like being attuned to patient-client, of like being a supportive presence, co-regulation, being in what I've heard from you and seen of psychoanalysis, and tell me if this is true, feels like a lot more than that in terms of the way that this relationship might be used to mirror things from the past and to work through those. Can you speak to that and what that looked like for you and what that
Yeah.
looks like in your work now?
Yeah, I'm not the most eloquent person talking about psychoanalysis in terms of theory, but I understand it very deeply. So what I hear you saying is that, or I guess just from my own experience, yes, people will recreate in the room the process, the relationship problems they have outside of the room, right? I believe that, and I see it happen every day. So the relationship in psychoanalysis becomes like a little experiential lab for,
Mhm.
okay, how are we relating or all right, I'm trying to find a good way to explain this. I'm thinking about a time when I got really angry at my analyst, right? She had said something that really made me mad and felt uncaring, or I didn't feel seen in that moment or whatever. And instead of just apologizing right off the bat, first of all, I think she was wrong and she did eventually apologize, but that should be noted. I was right. She was wrong. But the point was I had recreated between us this thing that I do with other people where I would not say what I really felt or thought. And then I would get a reaction from them that I didn't like, or that didn't feel like it was about me or mirrored what I was trying to not say to them, basically, but trying to get them to understand without actually owning it for myself. I don't know if this is making any sense, but basically I'd recreated that with her, and I had wanted her to just intuit something without me having to say it or spell it out. And she missed it, right? She just missed it. She didn't get it from my passive aggressive way of expressing it. And I got mad. And instead of her just apologizing, because I'm sure some of her stuff was in the room too, we looked at what happened between us. We looked at what I was trying to get and what she understood from what I was trying to say. And we looked at what could be transference and could be countertransference. What was her stuff? What was my stuff? And it became like this little lab where we could understand a process between us that most likely, and does frankly, happen outside of the room with other people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that sounds really powerful.
It was really powerful.
Ooh, let me repeat back what I'm hearing. So you come into the room with, and this is a pattern that I've seen a lot. You're like wanting something, but afraid for whatever reason of expressing that clearly and directly.
Yes.
Which I'll see in relationships a lot. People will be like, hey, like you should have just done this. Like, can't you just know this is important? Why can't you take initiative? Yeah. So you come in with that, your analyst misses it. You get angry. And then the conversation that followed, it sounds very two-way, the way you're describing it.
It was very two-way. It is very two-way because, like I said, there's two people's unconscious in the room. So it wasn't just her reacting to my stuff. It was her reacting to my stuff on top of her own stuff, and then me reacting to her stuff on top of my own stuff. It's very much a collaboration.
Yeah. That's something I feel like I've missed a lot in my own therapy. And I see it now that I'm in a relationship, like where it feels like there are really two people. So like when my stuff are triggering, let's say my husband's stuff, like we can talk through it in a way that feels meaningful.
Yes.
To what extent did your analyst share like what her countertransference was or what reactions it was bringing up for her?
I would say at different points quite a bit. Not necessarily the facts. I think you can know somebody without knowing all of their facts. I feel like I know her extremely well. I don't know all of her facts. After seeing her for 13 years, I know enough about her, but that comes over time, right? But I think in those moments, she would share her experience of what was happening inside of her, not like, oh, because I was injured in this way in my childhood, I now, that's not what we did. It wasn't about her. It was about me for that stuff. But she would share like, oh, I felt triggered by what happened between us. And so I think I responded maybe out of that trigger, not just responded as your analyst. Like, I think that happened from time to time, especially when there were big breaches in the treatment and big ways I felt like she had missed me or said something that I felt was hurtful. And if she felt it was her stuff, she would apologize, right? It's not always the patient misunderstanding. It's not always the patient's transference, right? You can't blame every rupture on the patient's transference. There's a piece of you in there too. So you have to be able to own that and apologize when you're wrong. Yeah. Apologize when you don't get it or you miss it. And she was very good at that. And that was really powerful.
Yeah. Owning what belonged to her.
Owning what belonged to her, right. Not making it my fault.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting as you're describing it because I feel like every relationship like is like there's no truth about like what's pathological and what's not. It's essentially just two people's worlds interacting.
Exactly. There's your truth, there's my truth, and then there's the actual concrete truth somewhere in between that nobody's ever going to know. Right? Mm-hmm. You can't come at it without our own stuff.
Yeah, I think the actual concrete truth is like the space that holds
Yeah.
all of those
Yes.
stories.
I think that's,
Um,
yes.
Something that you've taught me to do a little bit that I haven't seen a whole lot of elsewhere is to share my own experiences as the therapist. Not, and this, I was thinking about this in the context of self-disclosure, where it's not like I'm telling my story or what I've been through in the past, but what's like, so the way that this has come up for me is, let's say, I'm thinking of, yeah, but let's say like I have somebody who's coming in talking very intellectually, wants to just explain everything to me, difficulty going into emotions. You taught me to like express that I was feeling a little bit of a distance, or I feel like I'm sort of getting to know you intellectually, but I'm having a hard time connecting to you at an emotional level,
Mhm.
and use that as a jumping board. Can
Yeah.
you tell me more about how you use your own experience as a therapist?
Yeah. I think that our own feelings, when we've done enough work on ourselves to be, as clear as we can be about what's ours and what's theirs, right? Then we can use
Mhm.
how we experience a person to help them. We can say, gosh, I was feeling really connected to you until you took this left turn in your thoughts and went over here to this intellectual place, and then I felt really distant from you. Can we look at what just happened there for you? Like, can we look
Mhm.
at why you had trouble staying with the emotional space where we felt close to each other and went to this intellectual space where there would be more distance? I mean, using that part of yourself is that, to me, that is the work. That's where the work is, right? We were injured in relationship. We need to heal in relationship. And for that relationship to be real, both people have to show up.
Yeah, that feels true to me. Something that I think felt a little like I definitely had a reaction to, and I think it was something yeah, it was that same paper that I read from you was like it was saying something about, and you can explain this to me and put it into context, but something about the therapist like entering the role of, let's say, like the mother figure or parent figure who the child didn't have before. Um, I don't remember why it felt off-putting to me at the time. But but
I
it felt, this was why it felt like it gave the therapist so much power and put the patient in almost like this infantile, like
and
very dependent position.
that's interesting. I Here's what I think about that. I have multiple thoughts about that. One is that we do have a lot of power in these relationships, and that's one reason we need to be really, really conscious of ethics and being careful with our patients. We carry a lot of power, whether we want to or not. And I don't care what mode of healing you're working in. I don't care if it's CBT or DBT or psychoanalytic. You have a lot of power in that room. The patient comes in and gives you a certain amount of power. And we owe it to them to be really careful with that and really conscious of that, because it just happens naturally, and we're responsible, right? We're responsible for taking that power and using it to help them and not using it to be abusive in some way. Um, Even by just not acknowledging that it exists is not okay with me. So there's that. But also I think what you're talking about is when there's like a transference in the room that's paternal or maternal, where the person is kind of projecting onto you both what they got from a parent and also what they wanted and didn't get from a parent, right? Like those kinds of transferences happen. And I can feel it happen sometimes with patients where how they experience me is as they would have experienced their mother. And I can either use that for good or bad, right? I can either be the mother they didn't have and always wanted, or I can be the mother they had and be sharp and judgmental. And, I mean, that does happen. And I don't think
Yeah.
I think the patient is in a vulnerable place, but they're in a vulnerable place the minute they come to therapy, right? They are dependent on us in a way the minute they come to therapy. I don't think that's a power we take. I think that's a power that we're given.
Yeah. So acknowledging that power and being very, very careful with how we
Yeah.
use it. Can you speak a little more to the maternal or paternal transference? What are some of the indications that's showing up for you? How do you conceptualize that within a psychoanalytic framework?
Um, some of it is like a felt experience, so it's hard to put into words, but also some of it is you can see them react to something you say. Like if I say something, I don't know, fairly innocuous about a job they're pursuing or something, and they take it one way or another, like as if I'm saying, oh, you should take that job, or what they hear is, oh, you're not qualified for that job. Depending on what they hear, you can look at that and try and understand, and they may come back to a place where they're like, oh yeah, that's what my mother would have said, right? My mother was so critical and she would have told me I was not qualified for it. Or no, that's what my father might have said. He would tell me that what I needed to do instead of letting me discover it for myself. Like, you can see that happen in terms of their associations. And you can also see it happen emotionally. Like if you know, now granted, you don't always see this right away because you have to explore a little bit with the patient where this stuff is coming from. But if you know they had a really critical parent, and they hear anything you say as being critical, it really doesn't matter what you say, right? Because they're going to hear it as critical. And then you have to look at why they hear it as critical and try and take them out of that place of like only hearing you as a critical parent, but evaluating, well, this is what you said and this is what I heard. And what did you really say? And then I get to say, well, this is what I actually said. This is what you heard. And there's a big disconnect there, right? So what happened in that disconnect? Where is that coming from? Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? It's a hard question to answer.
Yeah. So there's a part of it that's a felt sense, which I imagine like develops. You've been in this for a long time, but you have a sense that they're almost giving their power to you in a way that a child might to a parent.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. You can see someone kind of regress, in the moment to a more childlike state. Mentally, I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're kind of giving you that power.
Yeah. Is there something in the space you're holding that lends itself to that?
Probably. I mean, I think, I think people are wired, given their experiences, to give us a certain kind of power or to fight giving us any power, right?
Mm-hmm.
As soon as they walk in the room, you can feel people who all they want to do is challenge your authority, what quote unquote authority, what they think you have over them. And other people who just want you to take all that authority and heal them. Right. So
yeah,
they're wired. But if your goal is to help them understand their own mind, if your goal is to help them look at their mind and go, why do you think that way? Why do you feel that way? Where is that coming from? Then it doesn't matter which way they come in wired, right? The goal is the same, help them understand their own mind.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I tend much more toward the let me fight, giving you my power. It comes out in less confrontational ways, and that's probably why I had that kind of reaction to that like really deep vulnerability.
But isn't that interesting, Elka? Like, and if you could look at with someone, why do you feel that way? Why are you so afraid of someone else having any power over you at all? Where does that come from, right? And help you understand a piece of your mind. It doesn't have to be something that's unconscious and happens automatically that you don't understand, right?
Yeah. And I really appreciate like what you've taught me and with psychoanalysis to focus on that directly instead of seeing it as an obstacle to treatment that we sort of need to like just kind of talk through or make it better. Like
It is
something that
that's where the treatment is, right there in the defenses.
And that also goes back to what we were talking about before of this not being this intellectual exploration, but that in those moments when it's happening, it feels so real and tangible. And in any form of therapy, really, we want to work with we need to evoke the emotion in order to work with it, and different approaches have different ways of doing that. And this feels like a really powerful one.
Yeah, it feels really powerful to me. It's all based on the relationship, right? So there is no blank screen. There is no, powerful authority is just going to tell you what to do to feel better or get better. There's just the relationship and the defenses we have against it.
Yeah. Can you talk about for you when you started to see this insight translate into tangible changes and what that looked like?
Wow. Um, yeah, that's a hard question because I think it was happening all along. I think I didn't quite see the big changes I was looking for because I kept looking for one instance of, oh, see, I just changed that. I think what it changed for me over time was the ability to things I couldn't do before, right? The ability to believe in myself, the ability to think that I had value and worth outside of what I looked like or how people responded to me. Like that I had value and worth just in being.
Mhm.
And then I could demand from relationship things that I hadn't gotten before, like
Yeah,
authenticity and trust and loyalty. And, I think over time it became really clear to me that those things had shifted without me even realizing it.
that's so interesting. To what extent do you feel like there was a tangible, it sounds like when you say without me even realizing, it sounds like it almost happened as a byproduct of the work you were doing.
Except it was about that's what the work I was doing was about, right? It's like there
Hmm.
wasn't this aha moment of, oh wow, that changed. It was sort of like over time I could look back and go, oh wow, all those things changed, right?
Hmm.
I think we're all looking for that aha moment. And it's not that I didn't have those, I did.
Yeah.
But that's not really what changes us. What changes us is taking that aha moment and living it out, you know?
Yeah. I feel like I'm missing a few steps in between. So we have your free associating, just letting your mind speak
Mhm.
in the space for 4 days a week, just a lot of it, like
Yeah.
really facing your pain head
Mhm.
on. So we have that on the one side. At a certain point, you start to feel like you have inherent worth, like you can, or
Which I
yeah,
think is a result of the relationship, right? I don't mean to cut you off,
hmm,
but I think
yeah,
learning that you have inherent worth can be the result of the different kind of relationship you've established and learning that you
hmm,
can be in relationship and not be rejected or hurt, right? Or betrayed kind of thing. And I think
hmm,
what I haven't spoken to yet, which may be the piece you're missing, is the value of interpretation or the changing that it does. There's nothing like a good interpretation to give you an aha moment. And it's not said as gospel, like this is exactly just because I see it and I think this is the right interpretation doesn't mean the patient has to agree with me. But if I offer
hmm,
an interpretation and it feels experientially to them like, oh my gosh, that's so accurate, right? That's the aha moment. And then it's how do you live that out? How do you walk that out in the world? How do you change how you think about yourself and how you think in general based on what you just learned about yourself?
and what does that look like, or what's that process of living it out?
I think it's an ongoing process of self analysis, right? I think it's an ongoing process of being out in the world, seeing kind of a similar dynamic occur and being able to think to yourself, oh, wow, there it is, right? There's that thing I
Hmm.
do. There's that thing I did with my analyst that I'm now doing out here. How do I understand that? And then looking back,
Hmm.
like, oh yeah, this is how we understood it together. And this was the aha
Hmm.
moment. Okay, how do I do that out here? How do I say what I really need instead of just being passive aggressive? How do I heal this breach between me and my friend that I created, not all by myself. There's
Hmm.
two people in every relationship, but you know what I mean? Like how do I heal my participation in that? How do I do that differently? And it's an ongoing process of understanding, letting yourself understand yourself without being so critical. Because what goes through our head
Yeah.
as soon as we make a mistake,
Hmm.
it's God, I'm so stupid. Oh, that was the dumbest thing.
Hmm.
Why the heck did I do that? That was just so dumb. That's you learn in analysis to think about it differently, to hold it differently. Like, oh no, that's
Hmm.
interesting that I just did that. I wonder why I just did that. I wonder if that's related to this feeling, or if that goes back to
Hmm.
how my mom would have treated me. Like you just learn to hold things differently. That's really the
Yeah.
power.
The story behind it changes from I'm broken or there's something wrong with me to this is what's been given to me and how I'm used to living it out.
Mhm. And how I'm used to reacting versus how I want to choose to respond now.
Yeah. To what extent that translation or that living it out, as you call that, to what extent is that actively encouraged in therapy or does it happen more naturally?
Oh, no, I think sometimes people can go through lots of aha moments and lots of therapy and never live it out. I think it has to be encouraged.
Yeah.
I think every week I would bring something back to my analyst of, well, so here's what happened this week. Help me understand this. Help me understand what the heck was I thinking or doing, or why could this happen this way again? Right. And we could look at it and go, okay, so here's the dynamic that we've talked about. Here's how it played out there. Now, how do you want to respond to that differently? So
So it was,
argument.
yeah. So it was actively bringing back when it came up outside there, talking it through, deciding what you want to do the next time, and then revisiting.
Yeah, because that's all about understanding, right? It's about understanding your mind. And your mind doesn't stop working when you leave the analyst's office. Your mind keeps going. Hopefully, your mind keeps operating. And learning how to be curious about it instead of judgmental about it is a big task.
Yeah. So if I were to summarize some of like that process, now I feel like I have a few of the steps in between. So you're entering the space where your experience is so totally and completely held and seen with no judgment, no expectation, no attempts to fix.
Yeah.
Alongside that, you have this relationship with this person who's able to hold all of that, all of the mess that inhabits your internal world and not reject you because of it.
Yeah.
Which gives you a kind of like an acceptance yourself for those experiences and a feeling of like I'm worth it and can be in a relationship even with these. And then you have interpretation, which is shifting the story around some of the things you're experiencing to this is my fault, I'm bad or broken, to this is what I've been given in life. And given my experiences, this makes sense.
Yeah.
And now that it's not an absolute part of who I am, there's also something of me that is able to shift it.
Yes.
And then you have the practice of incorporating that into your day-to-day life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very cool. One more.
Yeah, that was Elka.
Oh, thank you. One more big area. I feel like psychoanalysis is known for, and Freud's theory specifically for emphasis on, or I'm just curious about relationship with sex in psychoanalysis because you have like psychosocial development, Oedipus complex, all these things that, tell me about that and what role that plays and what that looks like.
Freud's different theories. If you ever read about Freud and you don't just read the theories, but also read kind of what was going on in the world at the time when he was alive, you see the correlations, right? Like why he thought the way he thought and how it changed and shifted over time. I don't think people actively look for the Oedipus in every situation anymore. I don't think that's like a thing, or at least not a very useful thing. There's always some old white guy in a white shirt and tie at the conferences looking for the Oedipus in every case that's presented. That's not very helpful. But I do think Freud's underlying goal of helping people to love and to work, right? That's what he saw as the necessary parts of life, to be able to love and to be able to work. Still stand, right? That's what we're still doing to this day. So I think sex in our society is very sensationalized and it's very, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, but it's controversial. People like to focus on it and then either be in favor or against. I don't think if you look at the cases Freud put out there that they're all based on sex. They're not. And do people talk about sex in therapy? Absolutely. It's an important part of life. But is that what the theory is based on? Absolutely not.
So a couple things I'm hearing you say. One is that Freud's emphasis on sex was a reflection of his time. Was that a reflection specifically of sexual repression and how that played out, or
Repression mostly? I mean, if
yeah.
you look at the case of Dora and how he talks about the sexual abuse that she experienced and then why her symptoms made sense based on what happened to her, and how all of that was then shut down because the people that supported Freud were the parents of kids like Dora. Right? And that was not socially acceptable. It's not going to be acceptable in his world to label these people as sex offenders. Right? So the whole theory then undergoes a change where he basically himself sublimates that whole part of it and calls it hysterical. Right? That's a hysterical personality disorder.
Yeah.
And if you look at what was going on in the world and in his world at that time, it makes sense. Like, it's not great, it makes me mad, but it makes sense. And then, I think that happens. Everybody's flawed. Everybody's a person. So we are a reflection of our time.
Yeah. Yeah. That it feels actually like a lot of what I'm trying to do in this podcast. I feel like when we other people or shut down different theories and we have this caricature of it, and then like the reason why I joined the personal story with the position is because people's positions make so much sense in the context of what they've experienced.
Absolutely. I believe that's absolutely true.
Yeah. And the other piece I hear you describing is it feels like you're taking his psychosexual development a little more metaphorically or beyond like those specific words to when you talk about love and work relationship.
Yeah, it goes beyond that. It's so much bigger than that. And I think Freud was a genius personally. And I think if he had lived, another 100 years, he would have come up with everything. Like, he was the one talking about how medicine was going to take over a part of what we do. And he was absolutely right. And there was no medicine back then. So like he could see things coming that most people couldn't see. And he did a great job of laying out everything he could, given his social situation, his background, his understanding, and the way the world was at that point in time.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit about erotic or sexual transference and how you work through that? Because I've definitely seen conversations among therapists about like, a client has expressed that he's sexually attracted to me. How do I navigate it? And there's a lot of like refer out, or it feels like psychoanalysis might have some tools to deal with that other approaches don't.
Yeah, I don't refer those cases out. I think if somebody is having sexual fantasies about me, there's a reason. And it's not about me. It's not that I'm just so enticing in the room that they can't stop themselves from fantasy. Like, that's not real. It's obviously a transference based on something else that's gone on in their life, or it's a defense against something they're trying not to think about or feel, right? I've had patients come back and say they had to quit therapy because they were having sexual fantasies and they felt too ashamed to bring it up. And that's what you don't want, because all that does is put it in the dark and makes it bigger and more powerful and not understandable. When that happens in treatment, I treat it the same way I treat anything else. Let's be curious about it. Let's think about why that might be the case for you right now. What's happening in you that would rather think about these fantasies about me than think about yourself. And I've never been unsuccessful at that.
That's very interesting. So two questions. So one is, what in the relationship is making it comfortable enough for the person to share that?
I think that's the non-judgmental space. If you can really create a space that feels to them too, that you're not going to judge what they say, it's really a powerful feeling for somebody,
Yeah.
And I recently had a case that a man that came back to see me because I knew his whole story already, but when I asked him why he had stopped, because we hadn't had a termination conversation at all, he just kind of disappeared. And he said it was because he started having sexual fantasies about me and he felt embarrassed and humiliated and like he couldn't see me anymore and he couldn't talk about it. Right. And I was like, well, what made you feel like you could talk about it now? Come back and talk about it. He's like, because I remembered, what did he say? He said something like, because I remembered how you responded to everything else that I said. And how I responded was, well, let's think about that together. How do we understand that? Right. And I didn't judge him for his uncomfortable thoughts. And I didn't judge him for this either. It was very much, well, let's understand what happened, you know?
That's really interesting to me. I have so many different questions on this, and I know we're starting to wrap up. I almost want to do a separate episode on it. But so when he's coming in with like saying, I was having sexual fantasies about you, you get curious about it. What's happening? What is it in this relationship? Can you share some of what those questions might sound like?
Yeah, I mean, well, with that, I mean, it really depends, right? Everything depends. In that particular case, it made a lot of sense. His relationship with his wife was really damaged and failing. The reason that he had originally started therapy was because his wife wanted him to go to therapy because he had had sort of a text affair with someone, not a physical affair, but kind of an affair over text. And she was really angry, and he and his wife hadn't had sex in years. And he felt humiliated and small and bad, and, like he had done this horrible thing. And so it made sense that instead of feeling feelings about that, he could just transfer his feeling onto me and have fantasies about me, and then not think about how bad he felt, right? Not think about it, not live in that experience of I'm humiliated and I'm here because I'm a horrible person, and all of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in that case, that's what it was about, and helping him discover, oh, I'm trying to avoid these negative feelings about myself by focusing on this external thing, right?
Yeah. What happened to the sexual fantasies as he started to get insight into what they were about?
They just disappeared. He stopped having.
Very interesting.
Now I'm not sitting in session in a skirt with a slit up to my thigh and a low cut. Like, I'm not encouraging anyway.
Right.
And honestly, they just disappeared. We talked about it, like, I'd say 6 months or 8 months later. And he's like, yeah, I haven't had one of those thoughts in a long time. So when you
really cool.
when you focus on what's really going on for the person and what they're really defending against, I saw it as a defense in that case, against his other stuff.
This question is in some ways a reflection of my upbringing, because I'm from a very religious upbringing where genders are very, very separate. It feels like there's sort of by default a kind of charge just between opposite sexes. But how do you differentiate, or is there a case in which like there might be some sort of, I don't know, sexual tension in a relationship that is less a reflection of transference and more of a reflection of just like you're in the room with somebody who maybe like in a different context you would have been really compatible with, and how do you navigate that?
Absolutely. I immediately think of another patient that I had who, he and I have very similar minds, right? It was really obvious really fast that we connected in a really deep, powerful way because we understood how the other person thinks. And and we had just a natural chemistry. And we, like, in another universe, maybe would have been best friends or in a relationship or who knows. And that happens, right? It's not like there's just one person on earth that you're fated to be with and you're never going to be attracted to anybody else in your entire existence. That's just not real, right? So I think in that case, it becomes a matter of management. I'm not going to sit around and let myself fantasize about him.
Right.
That's not my job. That's not why I'm there. That would be against my ethical code. So that wasn't an issue for me. And if he brought that into the session because he was having trouble not doing that, I mean, he's happily married, he's got kids, he's, this is, and I have an ethical code that would say there's no way, shape, or form you're going to ever date one of your patients.
Right.
So there's not like there was any inherent risk in reality. The risk was only in the room, right? It only felt still in the room. And we could learn something from that. Like, isn't it interesting that we connected so fast and have this connection where we understand each other in this kind of unique way? And how do we use that for good to help you?
Mm-hmm.
And then you channel it there. You channel that energy there.
Yeah. Was that something that you explicitly spoke about and addressed, or was it more
Um,
an implicit?
no, I believe we spoke about it at least once or twice, just in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
connection.
Yeah.
That he would say, yeah, I feel really connected to you. And I don't feel that connected to most people. I guard against feeling connected to most people. Like, so it kind of took me back. And that's one of the first things he said about it. And I said,
Yeah.
I acknowledge that. Like, yeah, I feel connected too. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like it was sort of an unusual connection at the beginning. And what do we
Mm-hmm.
understand from that? Like, what do we that's something that can be useful and helpful in treatment.
Yeah. That's also information about how he is as a person.
Exactly. It's also information about what he needs as a person from
Mm-hmm.
other
Yeah.
people, right?
Yeah. What do you want to wrap up with?
I don't know, Elka. You tell me. I feel like we've talked about so many different things.
We have talked about a lot of different things. Somebody who's listening to this and uh,
If they're wondering why they should try therapy, I mean,
mhm,
that's sort of where I go. Like it's so much less about the type of therapy you do and so much more about your connection with your therapist. The real relationship that's alive in the room is the most healing thing. So if you
mhm,
are thinking about going to therapy, keep seeing different therapists till you find one that you really connect with, because
mhm.
that makes all the difference.
That's such an interesting segue
Yeah.
from from talking about the merits of psychoanalysis.
Because I believe in psychoanalysis wholeheartedly, but do I believe it's the only way people can heal? No. Every research study ever done shows that it's the relationship you have with your
Relationship.
therapist more than the technique that they use that heals
Mhm.
people.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Denise.
You're welcome, Milka. Thanks for having me.